Hello everybody, welcome to week 3 of the course. It's an auspicious day to be discussing political theory. Tonight's the State of the Union address, so I encourage you guys to check that out and see how we've gotten from the Puritans to what political theory looks like today. I wanted to say great job on the discussion last week. I was very impressed by some of the observations and arguments that you guys were making regarding the distinctions between the Puritans and John Winthrop and Meacham and his notion of the American gospel. So let's see. Also, I have posted some comments and questions in the discussions as well. I typically try to do that on usually Sunday. I was out of town this past weekend at a conference, the American Political Science Teaching and Learning Conference. So we'll see if I learned anything about teaching you guys a little bit with that. So anyway, I posted my comments and questions on that. Typically, I'll try to do it on Sunday, but I didn't get back until yesterday, so I was running a little bit behind on that. But please do, take a look at those comments and questions just to, get a sense of perhaps some things that maybe you haven't considered or that you did. But I thought needed to be highlighted. So I put those in there, and then I'll discuss those a bit during this video right now. Okay, so last week we were looking at sort of the religious foundations of American political theory and American government, and I had you guys look at two different things, or listen to one thing and read another. One was John Winthrop's model of Christian charity, which was sort of a sermon that he actually gave going across the Atlantic from England to New England to try to, inspire and in a lot of ways embolden, right, the people who were coming over from England, because they were going into uncharted territory, and essentially they were starting anew, which really hasn't been done. Hadn't been done in Europe for centuries. So, it was probably frightening. But he laid out, this model of how sort of civil government and the Christian religion can reinforce one another, and why they were doing what they're doing. So the impetus behind, their movement was to create this more, Christian commonwealth, right? So the end of their aspirations were very Christian, right? And Winthrop talks about that when he's talking about he talks about the two laws, right? He talks about the two laws that essentially are supposed to guide their behavior when they're in New England. So one is the law of nature and the other is the law of grace, right? And that's a big distinction between, and we'll talk about this a little bit, that's a big distinction between the American gospel talked about by Meacham and the Founding Fathers, and the Christian religion laid out in Winthrop's model of Christian charity, is that they're pretty similar when it comes to the laws of nature, right? That's when we're talking about when Jefferson's talking about we hold these truths to be self-evident, he's talking about, what Winthrop would call the laws of nature, and what Jefferson even calls the laws of nature himself in the Declaration of Independence, right? So on this idea of, morality, which essentially is what the laws of nature are, how people should treat one another, right? And it's, essentially it goes back to this notion of the golden rule and loving your neighbor as you love yourself, right? And he says that, at least Winthrop says, that that's the foundation of all human morality. But where Winthrop and the public religion described by Meacham depart is in this notion of the law of grace, right? And that's when we're talking about, Meacham's talking about, Jesus Christ's teachings as they're portrayed in the Gospels, right? And what it takes to be saved, salvation, right? Salvation by grace. Man is essentially, fallen from grace, right? So he requires salvation to to ascend to heaven and to be reunited with God and things like that, right? So, and that gets to another important distinction between Meacham and Winthrop is that the public religion and the government that the founding fathers are setting up, the ends of that government were to give people on earth, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And we'll talk a little bit about the pursuit of happiness as well. But the ends of, Winthrop's God and religion that he lays out is, as he says in the thing, to not to store up your treasures on earth, where they can decay or whatever, but to, prepare a place for yourself to be saved in heaven, right? And but he thought in order to do that, in order to set up a society that could actually flourish and enable this type of Christianity, there had to be a good functioning civil government in place, right? And he talks about that, how civil government and Christianity go hand in hand, right? And how you need one to have the other, right? So they're sort of a partnership between the two, I guess you could say, right? But the American gospel that Meacham talks about is not concerned. It's really not concerned with life after death. It's concerned with life in life on earth, right? So yeah. So those are sort of the things that Winthrop was getting at. I ask you guys the question: what is the key distinction between Winthrop's God and Winthrop's religion, Christianity, and the public religion? And I guess it does go back to this question of ends, right? What is the ultimate end, right? And the end of the public religion was creating, this republic that protected these certain inalienable rights, whereas the end of Christianity is to be reunited in the afterlife. So they had very different ends, right? Okay, so looking at Meacham a little bit and thinking about this notion of the American gospel that he actually lays out, right? So one thing that's often asked is, were the founding fathers Christians, right? I mean, we hear this argument all the time, that America is essentially a country that was founded on Christianity. And we see, just looking at these two particular pieces, that it's a very tricky question to answer because, yeah, I mean, if you want to go back to the Puritans, where all the founding, they're the predecessors of the founding fathers, right? I mean, Christianity was a very strong influence in the colonies, right? But when you get to the actual founding, a lot of other stuff has happened as well, right? So, the founding fathers, for the most part, were theists, right? They believed in God, but they were also living during the age of the Enlightenment for the most part. And a lot of philosophy was coming out of Europe, John Locke, Adam Smith, all these guys, who were, challenging a lot of these fundamental Christian beliefs, right? So, and the founding fathers, Jefferson especially, and Adams, Madison, very educated, obviously Franklin as well, very scientifically minded people, right? So they were trying to sort of balance their understanding of God and religion with some of the new scientific truths that were coming out of the Enlightenment, right? So you could certainly say that they were theists, but saying that they were Christians is a little bit more challenging, right? I mean, so I don't know if you guys have heard or not, but Thomas Jefferson actually created his own Bible, right? And especially the Gospels. He just focused on the Gospels, but Jefferson took the Gospels that are found in the New Testament, the first 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he went through and essentially rewrote those Gospels, and he essentially crossed out all the supernatural aspects of Jesus and Jesus' teachings and left in all the moral teachings, right? So in a sense, he was very much, and this is consistent with the founding and the Declaration, very aware of the moral truths that were contained in the gospel, but a lot of the supernatural stuff, he left out, right? But he was, he did believe in God, and I think, this is what Meacham said about Franklin too, in the podcast we listened to. The divinity of Christ was questionable to these guys, right? So yes and no, right? Was it a Christian founding. Maybe in the morality, the moral standpoint, yes, but in the supernatural, go back to the sort of the laws of grace, the salvation, the stuff that Winthrop was talking about, maybe not so much, right? Another thing to know about the Founding Fathers, probably the most important thing to know about the Founding Fathers, is that they were political pragmatists, right? They knew how challenging it was going to be to form a government of liberty, right? And they knew that if they tried to make, let's say, Christianity the official religion of the United States, they knew that it was going to be very contentious, and it was going to sort of contradict these notions of liberty that they wanted to enshrine, right? Because the thing that always happens is if you have a theocracy, where you have an official state religion, right? You may claim that people have equal rights, but of course, if the people in power are of that particular religious persuasion, even if it's stated that the other individuals can believe as they choose, right? Or they're going to have the same sorts of rights. Their rights will be trampled on by the people in the majority, right? Which will be the people from the dominant religion. And even in the United States, even though we don't have an official religion, that happened well up into the 70s, where JFK was the first Catholic president that had ever been elected, right? Up until that point, all Protestants. So, and then of course the thing with Mitt Romney, right, being a Mormon, right? That was something that even still, it's debatable. Would he have done better at the polls if he were not a Mormon, right? So it clearly, even now, without there being an official state religion, it still plays a key role. So they knew that their task of trying to create sort of a liberty and justice for all society would certainly be hindered by the establishment of an official religion. But that's another thing to think about with the First Amendment, is that there are two clauses to the First Amendment, right, regarding freedom of religion. There's the Establishment Clause, which says that the U.S. government will not establish an official religion, and there's the Exclusion Clause, which says that people are free to practice any religion that they choose, right? The government cannot censor people from following a particular religious belief. So it's not only will we not establish, it's also we will not prevent someone else from practicing the religion that they adhere to. And another thing too, we hear this a lot, right, when this question comes up of what role did religion play? People always point to this notion of the separation between church and state, right? But an important thing to remember is that the Bill of Rights was not actually included in the first draft of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights, First Amendment, right, amendment to the Constitution, came afterwards. So this notion that the thing that we hold most sacrosanct as Americans, the First Amendment, you would think if it were so sacrosanct as we believe it is today, that it would have been in the initial draft, but it wasn't. So that's something to keep in mind. Something that came much later. Okay. Yeah. So here's another central tension that somebody actually mentioned between the Winthrop paper and sort of the American Gospel, and that's the notion of, if you read through the American Gospel or through the model of Christian charity, you find that Winthrop is constantly describing mercy, charity, community, justice, all these community-centric values, right? But that's often not what we think about when we think about American government, right? We think the first word, if I had to ask you a word that comes to mind, right, when you're thinking about American government, I'll give you a second to come up with something. What's the first word that comes to mind when you think about American government? Probably either freedom or liberty, right? So, it's trying to reconcile the notion of freedom and liberty that is enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and in America's public religion, as Meacham calls it, versus the community aspects and the justice aspects that Winthrop talks about and a model of Christian charity, right? And so those are the two fundamental driving forces in American political theory: justice and liberty. And the challenge becomes, how do you reconcile the two, right? How do you reconcile equality and liberty, right? If you allow people the freedom to pursue whatever ends, within reason they believe necessary, how can you at the same time expect things to be equal, right? And it begs the question of, what do we mean when we say equality or justice, right? Do we mean that everybody should have the same things, right? Do we mean everybody should have the same talents? Or do we mean that people, and this is the accepted answer, we mean that people should have equal rights, right? So, but it's been a challenge throughout American history trying to balance the equality that you hear about in the community that you hear about in Winthrop, and the liberty that's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and especially within the Bill of Rights. So there's another sort of key distinction that you can draw between Winthrop, which focuses more on the community justice aspect, and the public religion espoused by the Founding Fathers, which speaks to liberty, but also speaks to justice, right? And it speaks to promoting the general welfare, right? So it's this balancing act that sort of characterizes American democracy. Another thing that, and this is important, similarity between Winthrop and Meacham is that they both believed that there are fundamental, objective, even universal, you could say, I suppose, universal moral truths, right? And that those universal moral truths spring from a source, and that source is God, right? The laws of nature and God, right? In which, as Madison said, the laws of nature were created by God. John Locke said the same thing. So there are these universal principles, universal moral principles, right? In the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And for Winthrop, these universal moral truths, love your neighbor as you love yourself, love your God. Once again, these are universal moral truths that they spring from God, right? So in both cases, you have universal moral truths that spring from God, right? Some of those truths, so we kind of draw the line, with the public religion at the laws of nature, right? And we don't get as much into sort of the laws of grace that Christianity talks about. Yeah, and then, another key thing that they have in common is this notion of America being an exceptional place, right? It's American exceptionalism talked about again, right? And for Winthrop, America was exceptional because it was going to be this model of Christian charity, right? It's going to be the utopia where Christianity is practiced, perfectly, and Christianity can flourish, right? And they're supposed to serve as a model of the way they worship their God. All other people should look to them as, the leading, Christian community in the world, and the model for the way that they should behave. For Meacham, and for the Founding Fathers, the United States was supposed to be exceptional in that it's a model of individual liberty, right, and individual rights, and enshrining these moral truths into our government. Margaret Thatcher said one time that Europe was created by history, and America is created by philosophy, right? Philosophical principles, and that's what makes America exceptional. Is that it's not it's an overstatement, right? As we're going to see, history certainly plays a part, but the founding document of America was created largely through a combination of the religious ideologies that shaped the colonies and sort of Enlightenment era philosophy, right, that enshrined natural liberties. So once again, we see sort of this collision, right? You can look at the philosophy side being perhaps more on the individual liberties side, right, and enshrining the natural rights of man, and the religious aspect sort of containing the elements of justice and community. Although, at least ancient philosophy talked a lot about justice as well, not as much perhaps in the modern philosophers, but so you have that, confluence of those two things going on there, right? But in both cases, America is supposed to serve as the beacon on the hill. And a lot of people argue that even today, the rest of the world looks to America for moral leadership. Now, we have things like these torture reports coming out and things like that that show that, we're certainly fallible. But, we still have the Bill of Rights, right? And we still try to live up to those ideals. And, we're certainly not there. And, we were arguably even farther away from it when the Bill of Rights and the Constitution was written and the Declaration of Independence. But, yesterday we celebrated Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, right? So that was a step towards some sort of moral progress, perhaps. So this notion of American exceptionalism, is another thing, another thread, we could say, that ties Meacham and the founding fathers, with Winthrop and sort of this model of Christianity, although, exceptional perhaps in slightly different ways. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the religious foundations. Obviously, there's a lot more we could say. So this week we're moving into sort of like the era of the founding fathers, right? We're getting more explicitly into the founding fathers and a little bit after with Frederick Douglass. But, I ask you guys to watch the John Adams Live Free or Die, or Join or Die, right? And it's just a great episode. And every time I watch it, it kind of like, there are certain scenes where it just like I tear up a little bit. But anyway, that's great. And there's a lot of substance within that. So I ask you, when you're watching it, if you haven't watched it already, really pay close attention to the details, right? And think about, how fortunate we were to have somebody like John Adams in that situation. And imagine how things could have evolved if you don't have people of principle like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson or, George Washington to hold the line on a lot of these issues, right? And anyway, we'll get into that next week. I'm not going to get on the soapbox too much. But then the Declaration of Independence, of course, I want you to review that and read that carefully, and read it in light of the stuff that we've discussed this week, with sort of this distinction between the public religion and Christianity. And then the final is sort of it's something that we need to be doing, right? We need to be asking ourselves, are we living up to these ideals? And that's what Frederick Douglass is doing when he's talking about, what is the 4th of July to a slave, right? It goes back to that Langston Hughes poem that I recited at the beginning of the class. Who's free? Not me, right? Land of the free? Not for me, right? So, kind of holding our feet to the fire on that. Okay, so that's it for this week. If you guys have any questions, shoot me an email. Be happy to meet with you or chat about anything. Don't forget the State of the Unions tonight, and check out some of those comments that I posted. I'll post the new discussion. Will be up tomorrow. Have a great week.